An unsent letter for Paul Celan. To reply, verb. To write, verb. Actions that perform the true rites of my passage through this Paris of secrets well lost. Pain of disclosures surmounted by an idle rain, like a cafe offering its summer munificence. Why should I write beautiful lines in this city? Will the chestnut bloom twice if I do? Autumn always calls once, and provincial bees do not storm summer on Rue de Luxembourg. This is another hum, and traffic loiters in awe of it. Death beetle summer. Summon your autumn Elysium. To write, verb. To scratch the itch of tears, now dry. To remember, verbs too. Shall I send poppies in the post?
Good evening. I welcome all of you to the launch of Poppies in the Post by Debasish Lahiri. May I now invite the author Debasish Lahiri to welcome his audience and say a few words.
Thank you, Shongita. thank you all guests for coming here. It's very warm in here. I mean, we were told that Kolkata is in the grip of a cold wave, so I'm sweating. So let's hope it gets cooler, you know. Welcome to the launch of Poppies in the Post. I welcome everybody. I see a lot of my friends and students and teachers and colleagues over here, so it's a very welcome audience. It's wonderful to talk to this audience. There are some guests whom I do not know, some from abroad. Welcome here, welcome to Kolkata, and welcome to the book launch. I will not give much away by way of saying something about the book. I have written 104 poems, so I should not say anything. Practically, I should be the one silent today. But anyway, I will just mention the fact that we had an announced panel and there was one last minute change. We had to make a last minute change because Professor Binyamin, who is now VC at Bankura, had a VC's call. There was a meeting and he had to cancel last minute. So I was very lucky to have the real pleasure of inviting historian, poet, journalist, Professor Harish Mehta on board, and he agreed in a trice. So thank you so much, Harishda, for being on this panel again. I'm sure your enthusiasm will show itself in your views on this panel. And I now introduce the introducer. So it's a kind of a redundancy, I guess. Dr. Pradipta Mukherjee, my friend Pradipta, who teaches English literature at Vidyasagar College for Women. She has taken on the challenge of both introducing me and my work prior to Poppies in the Post, which will lead us to the events of this evening. Pradipta is an acknowledged film critic, and her work, in fact, could be savoured in yesterday's Statesman and the Marquee, where she wrote eloquently about women directors in Bollywood. Pradipta has been invited as plenary speakers abroad in Grenoble, in Paris 13 and other places. And we have shared a sort of comradeship when we wrote a book together, which was called Tragic Survivals, which was also launched at the ICCR in Kolkata. So I've known Pradipta for a long time now, and I offered perhaps the most challenging bit of the evening to her. I'm hoping that she's going to do it wonderfully well, and that she's going to give you a good picture of me. I'm hoping. Because when you know someone that well, you might not have a nice picture to paint sometimes. You know, people whom you know too closely. So with that, I kind of leave the floor for Pradipta to hold forth on the poet and his works. Thank you so much for coming again.
Good evening and a warm welcome, all of you, to the launch of Poppies in the Post and Other Poems by Debasish Lahiri. It is indeed my immense pleasure to introduce my friend Debasish Lahiri, who is an internationally acclaimed poet. He is the recipient of the Prix du Mérite Naji Naman Literary Prize for Poetry 2019. His poems have been widely published in journals and have appeared in French and in Portuguese translation. Debashish's previous 3 books of poems are First Will and Testament, published by Writers' Workshop in 2012. The second volume is No Waiting Like Departure, published by Authors Press in 2016. No Waiting Like Departure was also shortlisted as one of the 5 best collections of that year by Scroll and India Today. And Tinder Tender, Poems of Love and Loitering, was published by Authors Press in 2018. A translation of his selected poetry in French, titled Landscape Without Verbs, is forthcoming from Editions Epic, France, Algeria in 2020. Debashish's poems are comprehensive and eclectic in addressing a large array of human concerns: the miracle of birth, the loneliness of death, love and loss, hope and sorrow, reflections on nature, and contemplations on art and craft of writing. His poems have a broad scope in their invocation of diverse historical eras, geographies, and bodies of folklore, which gives his collection a comprehensive and all-encompassing feel. His poems speak to anyone and everyone. They cross geographical, historical, cultural, and national boundaries and address universal human questions and concerns. Recently, I came across a review of his book, No Waiting Like Departure in Transnational Literature. The review says that the structure of the book, No Waiting Like Departure, is similar to that of a verse novel or poetic travel diary, a textual expedition oscillating between familiar and strange towards deepened insight. The collection which preceded Poppies in the Post, that is Tinder Tender, poems on love and loitering, speak of the 9 rasas in Indian aesthetics. The poems in Tinder Tender are an exploration of these 9 rasas of love. Search and discovery, self-discovery, renewed over the lifetime of the imagination, locates the poet and his beloved. Sometimes an idea, sometimes more than physical. The beloved comes as close as the glass misted by breathing and then moves away. A pang of desire, calling upon absence like one loitering at a door, knowing full well that it would never open. Hope is despair, and despair is hope, leading to anticipation and desire in love. In most of Debasish's poems in Tinder Tender, I have often noted there is a fine balance between the euphoric celebration of love and a more downward emotional spiral. Equally enigmatic and powerful is the more dismal view of love which we get to see in his poems in Tinder Tender. I suppose it was rather difficult to find this control over emotion that his poetry brilliantly achieves in Tinder Tender. I often thought of asking Debashish, what do you believe to be the fulcrum in a love poem, emotion or the novelty of approach? However, his poetry seems to have been built on this notion of the inexpressibility of thought, the silence that simply cannot be broken. Being an Indian English poet, a very young, dynamic, talented Indian English poet, in Tinder Tender, Debashish took the challenge to resituate himself, particularly in his unconventional choice of dedicating an entire volume to love poems, particularly in an age where senior, established as well as contemporary poets are addressing social issues in their poems. Debashish, I think, consciously chose to deviate and break the trend in Tinder Tender. Debashish's penchant for crafting short poems that center on sharp images place him in the modernist poetic tradition and even calls to mind the tightly wrought poems, one may say, of the imagist poets. True to what critics have identified as Debashish's classical modernist impulse, this is, I quote, critics have called it Debashish's classical modernist impulse. Each poem is honed to evoke the strongest response in the tersest possible way, abstaining from verbose descriptions. The result is poetry that is compact, concise, sharply focused. Despite the modernist tendencies in his style of writing, Debashish is also adept at looking back for inspiration, infusing his poems with classical influences. Those who are familiar here with Debashish's poems know that Sufi writings, Amir Khusro, Mirza Ghalib, Tamil Sangam poetry, the Ragamala texts, Indian miniature paintings have greatly influenced the making of his earlier collections. They have helped him evolve. They have helped him mature as a poet. Poppies in the Post and Other Poems, the book that is being launched today, is a collection that brings together 6 sections of poetry crafted over 3 years of writing about life, locals, landscapes, art, and solitariness. The influences in the conception and imagery are both Indian and Western, local and global, here and now and in whole history, Hellenic and Sanskrit. A set of poems written on several visits to France and has the Parisian cityscape, the art of the museums and feelings of being an outsider at its heart. At times, poems are written in response to a photograph or say in response to a painting. The ekphrastic encounter of word and image fills such sections. For instance, on a painting of Patwa Haveli that you get to see here on display, inspired by a painting of Sri Ajoy Bandyopadhyay, the painter who's present here today. We consider him perhaps to be the last survivor of the Bengal School of Art, or a poem in the heart of a puddle, inspired by a photograph by Mouli Senapati. I have known Debasish since my university days, and he has always been passionate, extremely passionate about visual arts, painting, music. His poems in earlier collections like A Sea View or another titled Van Gogh's Moon, or say the poem To a Single Lotus That Bloomed on Ward's Lake. Ward's Lake is in Shillong, were directly influenced by European Impressionist canvases and post-Impressionist paintings. In Poppies in the Post, Debasish traces further his self-exploratory journey as a poet with these stunning visual motifs of Impressionist art. Poems are inspired by Claude Monet, the French Impressionist painter, Van Gogh, Paul Cézanne. In 2017, a trip to Monet's picturesque garden house in Giverny inspired the poem In Monet's Garden. The cover page of Poppies in the Post duly acknowledges Claude Monet, a variant of Monet's poppy field in Argenteuil. His love and appreciation for European art since his university years, frequent leisurely trips to Parisian Art Museum in the last few years, particularly Musée d'Orsay, the Delacroix Museum, Louvre Museum, Orangerie, Medieval Art Museum, Cluny, or a trip to Van Gogh's place Auvers Oise often finds beautiful expression in his poems. Poppies in the Post is both reflective and meditative in nature. Jerry Kimber, chair of the Catherine Mansfield Society, who has written the introduction to this volume, notes that the poems are deeply rooted in Western classical mythology, whilst at the same time reflecting his Indian roots. Poppies in the Post opens up possibilities for exploring fresh avenues, which I think will be discussed in greater detail in the course of this evening by our eminent and distinguished panelists. Sharat, awaiting. You are a quake in my earth when you have the plains at heart on your mountain seat. You are the turn in the churn of my clay on silent streets at dawn, as some imagist breaks my clod and between thumb and fingers buds your eyes. You are the pout in my dust, blow breath, that torches its mad lingering at the gates of abundant cities, though populous. Dust glows like grains of the mist of a glowworm's sigh when you exhale. You stand on the inertia of my closed eyes, like a single dewdrop on the petal of a shiuli, weighing of dreams as heavy as the earth, that a world of supplication cannot move, but only the dapple wind of the dusk butterfly's van can. You wash the darkness and light of Sharat in the eddy of my heart and keep your brushes fresh for another autumn. Contemplating this swirl of light in my heart shadow water, time tarries my day, and patience, unmindful of delay, becomes patient at the tail end of this traffic jam that has the purposelessness of my day at heart. Kolkata, October 2018. With this very short introduction, I hope to set the vibrant panel in motion, and once again I warmly welcome you to the launch of Poppies in the Post by Debasish Lahiri, and I hope we will have a wonderful and exciting evening ahead. We now formally launch Poppies in the Post. So may I now request our distinguished panelists to please come up to the dais and launch Poppies in the Post. Professor Julie Mehta will be anchoring the panel discussion and will be moderating the session. We also have very eminent and distinguished panelists. We have Professor Krishna Sen, former professor of the Department of English, University of Calcutta. We have Professor Harish Mehta. We have Anjana Basu, the writer. Shoikat Mojumdar, professor from Ashoka University, and of course Julie Di, our anchor for the event. Dr. Julie Banerjee is the author of Dance of Life, the Mythology, History and Politics of Cambodian Culture, a study of the resurrection of Cambodian culture post-genocide, and co-author with her historian partner Dr. Harish Mehta of the best-selling biography of the Cambodian Prime Minister Strongman, The Extraordinary Life of Hun Sen. She studied at Loreto House and Loreto College. Professor Julie Mehta has a PhD degree from the University of Toronto in English Literature and South Asian Studies and was faculty at University of Toronto's Canadian Studies program. She conceptualized and taught the Chancellor-endowed course on Asian cultures and literatures in Canada, world literature and post-colonial literature at the University of Toronto. Professor Julie Mehta was conferred the honor of the top 18 South Asians in Canada in 2010. Her award-winning translation of Rabindranath Tagore's play Dakghar was performed in Toronto in 2011 to critical acclaim. With this very short introduction to Professor Julie Mehta, I now hand over the session to Julie Di, and I hope she will be moderating the panel to her best ability. Thank you.
A very good evening again, and I am so touched that Debasish and Pradipta they've both given me the task of this felicitous launch. And without further ado, I am the bad cop for the evening. So I'll be keeping time with 5 minutes each at first, even 6 is okay. And is that okay, Pradipta? 6 or 7 minutes? 7 minutes is good? Okay. So we've extended that already. And the other thing is I want to give you a short trajectory so we're all on the same page how the evening is going to pan out. I will just say a very, very few words about how I envisage Debashish's poetry in this 4th volume. And just to say that I'm sharing this idea of his appropriating on a post-colonial theorist vantage, where he actually looks at Greek mythology and looks at Greek heroes with an easy and seamless transition into that world. And he brings that world into the world of South Asia. So if from my point of view, I'm sharing that with my master's students at Calcutta University, and the response is quite amazing. The other thing that is quite stunning about Debashish's new book is that, like Michael Ondaatje, who is a Booker Prize winner, writes poetry, is a South Asian Canadian burger poet, there is a lot of imagistic, visceral imagistic content in his work. As the panel unpackages that for us, I think that's one point that you would like to look at. And as Pradipta has already given us the preface, Debashish looks at the world as globally and locally. He looks at the world with all the performative arts. He talks about dance in some of his poetry. He talks about art in the plastic sense. And he talks about a personal history that intersects with Hellenic history. So he's a very complex writer, complex thinker, but a trenchant and concise and very sharp writer. So before I turn it to our panelists, I'd like to say that we are very thrilled you're here, and Debashish and Pradipta and I think three of us are looking forward to a conversation, an active conversation from you. So what we will do at first is we will let the panelists have a go, and perhaps after that we'll turn it to the poet whom we are celebrating today and let him talk about his work a little before we turn the questions on the poet. And he would surely like to read a few poems from this book. So we will start with Professor Krishna Sen, who has mentored some of the best in this city, and I am humbled that I'm on this panel with Krishnadi. Take it away, Krishnadi, please.
Very, very happy to be here because there are so many students and so many friends. And I'd always known Debashish's penchant for poetry, his penchant for poetry, because, well, he was a student and then he was a research scholar, or sometimes research scholar. And I've always known how forcefully he was attracted to the Western tradition, the music, the painting, as Julie has said. They were all part of him. It didn't matter that he was a Kolkata Bengali. They were all part of him. And at times I used to say, well, Debashish, what about our own tradition? So I would say that between 2012 and 2019, to bring out 4 volumes, and the last one with 104 poems, no less, is an achievement for a young poet. Very great achievement. And I'd like first to talk a little about how I see him developing from Last Will and Testament through No Waiting Like Departure, Tinder Tender, which I think is a lovely word, lovely oxymoron about love and loitering. I mean, Tinder and tender is what it all is about. And then, you know, there's a maturity because there isn't that forced oxymoron in the title anymore. When I was on the launch panel of First Will and Testament, which is, of course, it hits you in the mind. How can it be your first will and testament? But why not? We go through life making these testaments. And the last one, of course, we are not there to enjoy. And I said to you, Debashish, look, Debashish, I can make out you're a literature student. I can make out that you're a European literature student. And that should not be the case. T.S. Eliot should not be your maestro. You should be your own maestro. Remember, Debashish? And then, with No Waiting Like Departure, and I really love that title. I mean, if you go to Oslo as many times as I do, and to Seoul as many times as I do, no waiting is like the waiting at Singapore or Bangkok or Dubai for the departure. But then, you know, he had become lyrical, he had found his own voice, and I really celebrated that in that launch. I said, Debashish, you have shed the ghost of T.S. Eliot, and also Gayatri Spivak. Debashish, you are saying your own thing now. What I really loved about Poppies in the Post is that in Last Will and Testament, the European tradition was there, it was outside him, he was celebrating it. But in Poppies in the Post, as Julie pointed out, he has appropriated and interiorized it. I loved the way Debashish has become Manet, become Cézanne. Manet and Cézanne are not people out there whom he's celebrating. He's thinking and feeling through them, his own thing. That's what I really like, Debashish. You've come a long way, Debashish. I'm saying it as both your teacher, your professor, and a fan of your poetry. So, that stiffness, that Eliotian stiffness is gone. And what I found here is a great precision. Pradipta, Julie have talked about that imagistic quality. I have a lot of students here, don't I? Anjana, Julie, Pradipta, Debashish, and many others out there. But there is what I liked. It's not just the precision, which is a cold precision. There is a lot of cold precision in poetry. There's a very tensile toughness. There's a tensile toughness. I loved that tensile toughness. Okay? And I wanted, actually, instead of flapping through the pages, I took down a few lines that I could read out to you for what I consider a very textured and tensile toughness. For example, these are the lives I just loved. For example, in the poem to Paul Celan, and I'm a great admirer of Paul Celan, An Unsent Letter, he talks about death beetle summer. Death hyphen beetle, as in Arshula. And Paul Celan committed suicide, as if you remember. Debashish, I love death beetle summer. Debashish, you made it. I mean, that's a phrase, death beetle summer. And then I want to tell you the precision. Monet's poetry, Lotus Flowers, I looked back at it. I went into Google Images and looked at it again. And that is what it was. The cold muddle of the clear lotus stalks. That cold muddle gave you the shivers. That's what the picture conveys. But I'll just read out two short passages and end, which I really loved. And you know, poetry is something that you don't read and say, ah, ba, 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 very good, and then forget. There are words that go on in your mind. Death beetle summer is going to go on in my mind, Debashish. You put it in my mind. That's one thing my student has put in my mind. And these are the two passages I absolutely loved. Jerry Kimber has mentioned this as well. This is Cézanne, the poem on Cézanne, which is titled The Night of the Painter. Let me read this. I love it very much. Just one stanza, one short 4-line stanza. Brush stroke labor that breathes the madness of the lavender bush on a wild Provençal night in a still studio. I mean, that's Van Gogh's irises, that is Cézanne's. I felt the poem. And then what I really loved, and I'm going to end with this, is the poem on the death of Walter Binyamin, and it is a section on death, and I know that Debashish has felt some of those own emotions himself through his family connections. And if you remember, Walter Binyamin was hoping to make it through Spain and cross Atlantic to freedom in the United States, and he never got to it. And the way he was hoping to see the sea, SWE, the SEA, because that was going to be his gateway to freedom, the way he was hoping, I just want to give you that sense, which Debashish really gave me. The poem is The Death of Walter Binyamin. All through the night, the sea appeared to him on a hillside. He was crossing hills trying to get to the sea. And all he saw was not the hills, but the sea. In a hollow of foam and lilac, that were his eyes. All he was seeing was the sea. But you know, I don't want to end by giving you the notion that Debashish can only do beautiful images. Like the death beetle summer, there is a line in a very small poem that has got inside my head and is going to stay there, Debashish. The poem is called Watch Your Step. You may have missed it when you look through the book. This is the line. Only hope knows fear. When you get to my age, you will understand it. Debashish, you understood it. Only hope knows fear. Thank you so much. I'm so happy to talk about Debashish's poetry.
Thank you, Krishnadi. That was awesome. Touche. I apologize. So keen to hear Krishnadi speak that we forgot to introduce her properly. So let me do the right thing. You stayed within your time, so that's the least we can do. So, apart from the fact that she's mentored half of us who've been English literature students in Kolkata, she was professor and head of the Department of English, University of Calcutta, and is currently visiting professor at the university's Women's Studies Research Centre. Also British Council Scholar, University of Kent, Fulbright NEH Fellow at UCLA, the Leverhulme Professor of English at University of Leeds, and lectured at Stanford, Berkeley, SOAS, and many other places. Our next speaker is Anjana Basu. She is an advertising consultant in Calcutta. She has a book of short stories by Orient Longman India. I'm just reading what was given to me. Is that okay? The BBC has broadcast one of her short stories, and her poems have featured in an anthology by Penguin India. She's appeared in the Antigonish Review, the Edinburgh Review, and the Salzburg Review. Her byline has appeared in Outlook, Outlook Traveller, and Condé Nast Traveller. She has 7 novels and 2 collections of poetry to her credit, and we all looked up to her when we were in Loreto House as English literature students. She has written poetry since she was very young. So go ahead, Anjali.
I'm very happy to have met this book of Debashish's, and ever since First Will and Testament, I've noticed this tendency of Debashish to wander. He is a wanderer at heart, and his poems grow more and more nomadic, which is very delightful. He takes the reader into places which they would not normally have the pleasure of visiting. And at the same time, he links a tradition of classicism, sometimes a tradition of romanticism to these poems, to these places, so that there is a kind of traveling backward and forward in time. Added to that is a felicity for titles. For example, First Will and Testament, which is a title which you would not expect. You would go with the last, and then you find, well, okay. He started with his First Will and Testament. Or alternatively, there is Tinder Tender, where, I don't know, deliberately or otherwise, Tinder is a dating app which is very popular among young people. Debashish, was that in your head?
No, I didn't.
It wasn't. Okay, because I looked at Tinder Tender and I said, hang on a sec, Debashish is getting smartphone generation. This is love poetry with a dating app. But nonetheless, yes, that is a title that one certainly remembers. And No Waiting Like Departure, yes. Many departure lounges in many airports across the world, filled with phrases that are beautiful, phrases that are sometimes skeptical. They encompass everything that Debashish has put together in his literary career so far. I think there will be more. As to the ghost of T.S. Eliot, I think he still hovers. He's there somewhere murmuring over Debashish's shoulder. But to get to the new one, Poppies in the Post, it is, I think, what is memorable, well, the ones that touched me were the Parisian poems. The lovers wandering in the Musée d'Orsay, Van Gogh, Lost in the Night, the stars, the edge of the stars which forever glow yellow overhead. He wanders through the lanes of lovers, he wanders through many quiet places of Paris. And then he goes to Giverny and explores Monet's colors, which are then put on the cover of the book. At the same time, there are voyages to the city to which he belongs, Calcutta. For example, I just love the title Durga Puja and the Secret History of Light in City, which, along with autumn and city streets and night, brings in Greek amphora and characters from Greek literature. Sorry. Somehow he manages to meld Durga Puja and autumn nights in Calcutta with Greek mythology and possibly an undercurrent of Mahishashur with the Minotaur, which is very interesting for those who understand the relationship. He has in his verse unusual lines and lines which grip you. And since we're sitting on Park Street, I would actually like to read a bit from Park Street, A Cloud Study, which is another of those titles I like. In vain I searched the face of the city for wonders, but found it on the ladder of its eye, the limp right hand of a cloud dangling beside the armchair sky. Please note that sky, the cloud, an armchair and an arm languorously over the edge. And we are sitting on Park Street, which is a place where people wander, where people languorously explore food, leisure, and many other things. It is a busy street, a busy time, and it is a place where, as he writes, the cloud ruminates the city. It must, for only in contemplation can it be so light. So he talks about the clouds on Park Street and the lights, and light is incidentally a theme which recurs through his poems, as in the light of Durga Puja, as in the lights in Paris, as in the lights of other cities rippling on river waters, or the light of the sun which is saying a cold goodbye to winter, which is another of those lines that rather caught my fancy. And I think this combination of Impressionism, along with, for example, an evocation of Sarojini Naidu, sums up the influences that are our work in Debashish's psyche and that are evolving into poetry that is complex. His lines are in fact complex on many occasions, though he has surprised with a series of one-word poems, one-word line poems, which you will discover. He also explores many of the classical themes of poetry. So in that sense, he is traditional. He does not go Gen X, modern, hep, which I might have expected from Tinder Tender, but never mind, I'm pulling his leg. So it is traditional, it is conservative, but at the same time, it is modern, Western. It is a new line of thought for a scholar with roots in Bengal, discovering his soul in Europe and in Western mythology. And congratulations, Debashish, on a remarkable piece of work. I love the book.
Thank you, Anjana, for that insightful unpackaging of Poppies in the Post. It's my pleasure to call on journalist, academic, historian Harish Mehta, who has a PhD from McMaster University in Canada. He has published 4 books on Vietnam and Cambodia. The most recent, People's Diplomacy, in October 2019. He's been writing poetry for a long time and has them published in the 70s. His articles have appeared in the US journals Diplomatic History, The Historian, the International History Review, Peace and Change, and History Campus. Debashish's poems, as I mentioned very early when we were speaking, brings in Hellenic history at almost every turn. And one of the lines that I remember, before I turn it on to the historian here at the panel, is, I have looked at the sea over Helen's shoulder for centuries. Helen's old lovers have perished. Harish?
Julie, thank you so much. I'm actually a Lucknow boy. तो लखनऊ में कहते हैं कि अगर आपको किसी ने कह दिया कि 7 मिनट आपको देंगे, तो 7 मिनट तो लखनऊ के पोएट्स को तो गला साफ करने में लग जाते हैं. तो इसलिए गला वाला तो साफ करके आ गए. और प्रोफेसर्स और क्रिटिक्स ने मुझसे पहले देबाशीष साहब की सब लेख को क्रिटिसाइज करके आपके सामने पेश किया है. तो हमारे लिए तो बहुत कम बाकी है बोलना. और अभी अंग्रेजी में भी थोड़ा बोलें. अच्छा, in English, poetry in English in this country, it remains and has always been a very limited form in terms of the poets themselves and their audiences. You know, it's always been a very limited genre. This is a large country where the dominance of the poets, if you go to Lucknow where I'm from, it's Urdu. Poetry readings will begin somewhere at about 6 o'clock and they will wind up early morning. So you can go on for hours. They're called mushairas. And the flame is passed around. And the giants of poetry are in your presence. But English poetry has certainly a dynamic place because we are a post-colonial nation. And we have been rather well trained in the language. And especially when you come to Debasish and his romance with the historians and the historical episodes of Rome and Greece, it's nothing new because a lot of our best writers that we produced, V.S. Naipaul, Dom Moraes, Niraj Chaudhary, Shasti Brata, they all sort of look to the West in their poems, in their writings, and they saw, particularly, let's say, Naipaul and Niraj Chaudhary, saw the West as the epitome of excellence, of goodness, of everything decent. You know, now I'm not getting into the colonialist argument or the imperialist argument or that we should be, as Indians, opposing all that the West offered. But clearly, there is something for the literary mind, there is a lot to latch on to when you look at those countries of the West. So what is Debashish's genre? It is really the English, and the English world as he sees Rome, he sees France, he sees their poets. So Debashish's genre is this English, the area is English, and he is successfully creating a local audience. Now, the creation of a local audience takes me back to my own youth, if I may. Growing up in Bombay in the late 1970s and the early 1980s. So who were the role models that we looked up to in the Bombay poet world? If I walked down, I was introduced as a young man I was in my 20s, and a colleague of mine who worked in the same newspaper as I did, one of his closest friends was a gentleman called Adil Jasawala. Another of his close friends was a young gentleman called Arun Kolatkar. Adil Jasawala was a lecturer in Bombay University at St. Xavier's College, and Arun Kolatkar was a very successful copywriter, art director in advertising. Adil Jasawala had just begun writing good poetry, was getting recognized. Arun Kolatkar hadn't been recognized and was struggling with his new book called Jejuri, which goes on to win tremendous acclaim. So this was the atmosphere we had, where we all were we were younger than these guys. And then, of course, there was Nissim Ezekiel, who was a great poet himself. And there was Dilip Chitre. And then suddenly Dom Moraes comes back from Oxford. And, he grabs everybody's attention. So what we had there was a whole generation of young people, younger than these guys by 10 or 15 years, growing up in awe of their talent and what talent it was. So by the time we reached our 40s, all of them had published widely in Penguin and all the Western, they were recognized authorities. So the point here being that Calcutta has a tremendous audience of readers, perhaps little less in the English language, but a tremendous and a burgeoning following of your Bengali poets. Yeah? And also a lot of Urdu poets, yeah, as we know. So the English genre, to my mind, has somehow waned to a certain extent, which is now up to Debasish to resurrect to a certain extent. And for Debasish, what we will see is that he's going to be leading the charge of this Light Brigade. So Debasish belongs. He belongs to, and my job is really to locate him, because everybody has already criticized his and dissected his work. So my thing is to kind of find where is he, who is he, and where does he really belong. So he belongs very much to a revival of the Calcutta English poetic movement. There are a number of rather good poets in the city, but what disturbs me about young poetry writers is that their phrases are easy come, easy go. It is just too clever, too quick. It doesn't seem grounded or rooted, and it lacks authenticity. All of which Debasish has. He has the art, he has the credence, the gravitas, and the authenticity, which he brings into his work from his tremendous academic knowledge. His individual verses are almost like little miniature works of art. When he's talking about the paintings of, say, a Western painter, each of his stanzas is like a sketch. That's what I looked at. His language is very closely crafted, hammered and chiseled out, and he is a man, a poet for all seasons. He brings to life the seasons, the light, the quality of light and darkness, the grays and the tones. Like a painter, he observes. Just a couple of things I wanted to share with you is that in Lucknow, again, at the end of a certain poem, the last line is what drives the audience mad. And then they'll clap, and the clapping will go on forever. So some of his poems also have that quality. And there's a stanza in Yellow Lane Diaries, which is about the Chinese of the city. So it says, living in a meager lane with nothing but rice, in a split bamboo bowl and water in a girt cup, can be noble too. And just before I leave, is his ability to create language. And that, I think, is the real sign of a great poet, is the use of the language, and to really create your own language, to take English away from its archaicness. And while he deals with, say, semi-archaic historical subjects, but what he does to it is a whole rejigging of the old into his own, into a Debasish language, which is, for example, beyond the timid fringe of words and ink and blood salt, and then of course he goes back to the archaic when he says, they watch the gasp of frail thewed breath. Thewed. That you'll have to explain to us what that is. And
You have half a minute left, Dr. Mehta.
yes, and finally I shall not leave you without a sense of the abject. In his juxtapositions, he excels. For example, despite the scent of sewers and soya sauce, he's taking you into the Chinatown of yore. So with that, I think I've covered all my points, and I shall leave you with the idea that Debasish is a poet in the English language, but he's a Bengali poet, and I think a lot of his experiences of Bengal are to be found in this volume, side by side with his with his discourses on Western art and artists. Thank you.
Thank you, Harish. The last panelist to speak today is Choikot Mojumdar, prolific, well-known, a writer for mainstream print media, recipient of grants and fellowships, as covetous as the Mellon Foundation and Jawaharlal Nehru Institute of Advanced Learning Studies at JNU. His most recent stint was at Stanford as an academic. Choikot was educated in India and the United States, and he's the author of 5 books. Most recently published novel is The Scent of God.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really was a pleasure listening to you talking about. Listening to the kind of really went back to Bombay for a moment. I just want to add one little strand of thought to what I think Harish really pointed out. There was indeed a vibrant poetry scene in Calcutta Writers' Workshop, and it still continues. And that's exactly the same time when Nissim Ezekiel and Clearinghouse is sort of taking the poetry scene ahead, right? Bilal and Writers' Workshop is actually sort of really launching it. And I was fortunate to go to college in St. David's College here and taught by Professor Lal. And I think we're sitting right here in the middle of the vibrant epicenter of Calcutta's poetic scene. So, I mean, this is a great location. Every time I come to Oxford, it's wonderful to be there. I mean, that being said, I was going to say that I do feel like a bit of an imposter on the panel, not being a poet. But before I realized that many of the panelists are not poets. I mean, I'm primarily a novelist. I am a critic of prose, very much a critic of modernity. I think poetry becomes fascinatingly different with modernity. You know, pre-modern poetry is performative, it's oral, it's connected to religion and ritual. With print, it becomes a different animal. So my connection with Debashish's poetry, as I was reading this book, ended up being through modernism. And as a scholar of modernism, as somebody who delights in that milieu, in that incredible sort of flowering of literature, art, film, architecture from the late 19th to the early 20th century. And we've talked a lot about the ghost of T.S. Eliot, and I think it's a ghost that is sort of not exorcised easily from any of us, from Debashish, and it's fine to have, you know, Mr. Eliot peer by from the shoulders and sort of look and sort of make some comments as want to do. Because of course, you know, Eliot himself, you know, kind of laid the blueprint of when he wrote Tradition and Individual Talent, that this kind of Oedipal struggle against your influence, your Oedipal struggle against is kind of endless. You know, the club obviously changes and you become part of it. And I was thinking of, you know, Harold Bloom and his interpretation of romantic poets and his relationship with Milton. It's a fruitful thing. I think you're very right when Professor Sen was talking about that finding his own voice. That's something, you know, we all eventually get to. I think with painting, copying the masters is a phase. I don't think that's something one can say of literature. I do teach creative writing as well, and I say that, you know, that's not a phase we need to go through. And at the same time, this productive struggle with a kind of a powerful ancestor is in fact a healthy sign. It's a very healthy sign. And while reading these poems, especially, you know, the saying of Eliot which kept coming back to me was something, you know, I'm sure all of you know, Eliot's comment that the true poet unites sound of a typewriter, reading Spinoza, falling in love, and the smell of cooking. So, you know, the whole olfactory, tactile, emotional, and intellectual, all these feelings come together. And Eliot's, you know, obviously big beef was with Milton, though the beef was also for political reasons, that, you know, before Milton, you know, to think and feel were not different. Now suddenly dissociation and sensibility has set in place and they have become different functions. And what I find admirable whenever I look at a poet or a novelist or for that matter an essayist or a critic, what I look for is whether they are able to deconstruct the binary between thought and feeling. Whether to think and to feel are different things, or one thinks and feels at the same time. This false binary between the mind and the heart and the brain. I mean, Eliot again said that the poets, he's rephrasing this, older poet, look into your heart and write. I mean, why heart? Look into your heart, your brain, your digestive tracts. And this is the quality which I think I did find in Debashish's poems, that it is multisensory. In fact, when I'm sort of teaching creative writing, I often find myself thinking, what is the kind of writing that one might call creative or imaginative? It's a fruitless task. For me, it has two qualities. One is, it is particular. Like the social sciences are interested in larger patterns and structures. In literature, in art, we're always interested in a particular, a unique, a subjective moment. I mean, think of Susan Sontag's experience, against interpretation, the argument. And the other is it's multisensory. And that is something which I think is all over, right? From the cover, you can see that the question of painting, the sound, it's very Eliotian in that sense alone, that it really makes you inhabit a certain point, a certain space and time. So in a way, I think this is a very productive kind of a, I do see, there's so many, like Anjanadi as well. Some of my favorite poems in this collection are the Parisian poems. And here again, Debashish is working in a very important modernist tradition, the kind of ekphrastic poetry, the poetry of iconography, the poetry about painting, poetry about other art forms, the experience of being in an art museum, an iconic art museum in Paris, and the feelings it evokes, whether it's Rwanda. And that, I think what is gratifying is that the canonicity, the grandeur of the moment hasn't weighed him down, but the sensory nature of the experience actually comes alive. I mean, this is again the beauty of literature, I think, as compared to other art forms, and the comparison kept coming back to me repeatedly while reading these collections, that, in one way literature is different from all other art forms, is that it is the only art form which is fully artificial. And I say this not in a negative sense, but in a neutral sense, that all other art forms have a sensory content. Music appeals to the eye, painting appeals to the eye, music appeals to the ear, painting appeals to the eye, all of them. Literature is the only art form which uses language which is fully artificial. And of course, as you know, Saussure, that the connection between language and reality is completely artificial anyway. But that is again the beauty, reading these poems, you realize that is the advantage writers have over painters or a filmmaker, that no matter how carefully you're describing a reality, the reader is always going to imagine something different. It's always the case. You cannot, and I'm talking of the most realist way of writing here, even then. And you can say the person who's wearing a red shirt, or the person as in Debashish's poem, you're standing in this museum looking at this painting, looking at this flower. It's always a different kind of even the word blue, the word bottle, even the word pen, the most empirical words do not mean the same thing. They mean different things to everybody. And the most obvious example of that is when we go and watch a movie based on a book, we always come back and say, we never said that, oh, that's exactly how I thought Darcy should be. That's exactly, it never happens. It could be better, it could be worse, but it's never the same. And that is because when we read something, there's a blank space that is created in our mind. And that I thought was really a striking feature of this book, that it is actually so sensory in content. There's so much visual material, and yet it hasn't failed in evoking that blank space. That blank space on which I can be a writer again. When a director shows a shot, you can also interpret it in different ways, but there's at least no debate about what was the physical nature of their shirt or their whatever, or how they were, standing, or whether they were sitting. Or the physical realities are not in the debate. But what is the beauty of literature is that even if you describe things realistically, the writer gets to write all over again. This is what Roland Barthes talks, the writerly text, the text which invite writing again, and all readers are writers in every way. And that is what I thought was really well done in so many of these poems, that so much of this visual material sort of seduces me to a certain multisensory space, and yet at the end of it I'm left with liberal amounts of blank space where I can recreate this all over again. I'll an example from one of my favorite passages in one of the poems. Again, I pointed this out, Musée d'Orsay, Random Notes 3. It's a beautiful ending. I'll just read the last stanza. Unaware of my presence, the lovers fall apart, as if catching each other's perspective for the first time. I inhabit my absence. I inhabit my absence. This is the kind of phrase I'm talking about. The perfect, the language should surprise. That's the element. There's not a single word here which is really difficult, and yet there's an element of shock and surprise. There's a certain element of paradox, that how does one inhabit one's absence? And it's, again, we know exactly the feeling when you're caught in the presence of two lovers who are absorbed in each other. You know that in some ways you are an absent figure. You inhabit that absent, and you want to be absent because you don't want to interrupt, their absorption in each other. And that is exactly the feeling which I think Debasish captures so well, that I think one of poetry's key jobs is to how to negotiate the concrete with the abstract. All art is an endless negotiation between the alien and the familiar. We all want to read something and say that, oh, I know exactly that character, that's like my neighbor, that's like my gossipy aunt, that's exactly how my mother nags at me. But at the same time, we don't want just that. We also want the cold hand of the alien. And all art is an endless negotiation between the alien and the familiar. What the proportion is depends on what you're writing. If you're writing science fiction, you need more alien. If you're writing, poetry like Jane Austen, or fiction like Jane Austen or Shashi Deshpande set in the familiar, it's more familiar. But either way, there's always the dialectic. And when you come to a stanza like this, you realize that it is such a mundane moment. Walk into a museum and observing yourself in the presence of two lovers, and yet it is a phrase that I inhabit my absence, that it brings the alien back into the most familiar. This is the connection between the alien and the familiar, which I think Debasish has achieved remarkably well. So congratulations on your collection.
Thank you, Shoykot. So that the audience has a chance to interact. Let's go straight to Debasish and let him have his say. And please, if you would kindly read one bit of a poem which jangled me, which was after the clinic, I feel a lifetime's pause in a jangle of keys. That really resonated with me when my mother passed away. But, you can read that later if you have time. If you have something else, that's fine, Debasish.
Oh, it's fine. I just, since a lot has been spoken about the collection of poems written in France, so I thought that I would read one poem from that section, just as a kind of a little balance, because some lines have been quoted, so I thought that I would read one poem from that section if possible. And it's quite right, Julie. I am the first among the audience, so because I've been listening till date. I'll be the one listening. So I am the audience. So yes, the first one who speaks on the side of the audience is me. So here's that poem that I'm going to read for you. This poem is called, it's a very short poem from, because Shoykot has mentioned Musée d'Orsay poems, Anjanadi has mentioned them, Krishnadi has mentioned an unsent letter, and many of the other poems. I'm going to read a completely kind of off-the-cuff little poem, which is called On Mount St. Victory. This is page 35. So I'm going to just read that poem. It's a very short poem. Some of the other poems are slightly longer. But I'm going to read this short poem for you today. On Mount St. Victory. The eyes are small enough to hold all the sky and sea in a glance. I sail on the wide sea of your eyes, my eyes rowing your tidal eyes the rudder. And yet, we are far from the sea's recital of time's fugue. On this mountain, an axe chips sound into silence and echo, you and me. Thank you. One more?
No, you read. It's your day. We're celebrating you.
I'm just, you're the one in charge of the panel, so of course I have to take your permission. I'll read something else. I take this opportunity to read a poem from the rather eclectic section which I've called In Camera Poetica, where there are about 6 poems, and all of them are written on either photographs or paintings. One of the paintings is right here behind with us, the painting of Patwa Haveli. And so I thought that I would read that, and since the painter himself, although he's missing a little bit right now, so anyway, so I let's read that poem. So I thought that I should read that poem. This was sent to me as an image on the computer, and I had to go to his place to actually see it in full size, actually, because as we all know, the computer plays tricks on the eye in terms of color and everything else. So I had to actually go and see the painting before, and the poem came later on. I mean, the poem didn't come immediately. The poem came maybe a week, even 10 days, I think, later. It was a sudden kind of impulse to write the poem. So here is that poem on a painting of Patwa Haveli. On a painting of Patwa Haveli for Sri Ojoy Bandyopadhyay. On an odd angle of a palaced shoulder, the painter's eye stills the flight of winged light. It is the 9 rasas in stone, turning toward, turning away. Dalliance and disaffection chiseled into harmony till they are all beggars on a hot day waiting for the arms of a turmeric sun. The light that courses down through fingers of stone, parted by the munificence of heat, paints shadows in gold. Way down, sun-sheltered, stone is softened into boughs of stone by the pumice stone of the imagination. Is it rather recounting the dark reluctance of our lover and his darker ambush to a friend who finds that the cool alcove has been ignited afresh by the tale? Even interdict time holds back from the gateway to this sun-dark street that changes like changelessness. Thank you.
Read on, Debasish. Please read on.
Lots of poems. Is it on? Yeah, thank you. It's called A Death in July. It will happen, I think, in the candlelit island of a study. Not yet late for pigeon light, the candle shall burn by day, because clouds had padlocked a sky of birds. The quiet shall sound trumpets that stone-veined limbs shall dance to. One last dance that even the eyes of stone shall leap to, in patterns of dawn's lifetime of calligraphy. In that windless tenement, rags of prayer shall wave round dying flesh astride a chair, a prayer for rain in a dry mouth that shall not hear in the room's blind still life the harp-shaped voice of the rain's dust plucking at 1,000 strings of grass. The shuffle of feet politely strangled by the carpet, a stumble of love's woman-breasted memories, where even rain recollected has hardened into fossil, shall lead him away from the room's buried spring to the last harm he hadn't prayed for. In a bureau full of paper, he couldn't find a pen. Thank you.
You have been teaching us in the colleges as well, in the college as well, and the only thing that I was all the time asking about the imagistic approaches, that imagist poems, and apart from that, the poem that you have written, how do you work with the fusion of ideas? I mean, I find Eliot more merciful than you. I mean, when I read Eliot, he is a bit understandable to me than when I read your poems. For instance, I'll quote an example, because there are intertextual references that I can entangle, that I can read and entangle it through many other ways when it comes to Eliot. But when I read your poems, like there is a line that I'm quoting from the poem Waiting for Departure. And that was something like, I bore the burden of my travels like an empty heart does its memory of blood. So how will I get to know this? You used a simile like, so I may tend to, I can bring some parallelism with that, but and there is no problem with the words. I mean, I can keep a dictionary with me all the time to try to understand you, but how will I understand this? What do you suggest us to read, to initiate as being a layman?
Can I just ask you to repeat the quotation from the poem so the rest of the audience can hear?
Okay, I recollect the whole poem. Across the blue sky walk, round which the wind was blowing, thick gusts of darkness above, I bore the burden of my travels like an empty heart does its memory of blood.
Yes. Yeah, thank you, Nitesh. You said that Eliot was easier to kind of fathom or understand.
In comparison with you, sir.
That's exactly the point. I mean, I'm scared out of my wits. But I can see where you're coming from. I mean, because our students, because when we go through the system of our education, I think we are so absorbed. We are taught by our teachers to be like that. Some of us are like that. Western art, the absorption in Western art and Western literature is something more familiar than perhaps someone who chooses to go the other way. So, I know that reading Indian literature is seen to be more challenging than reading Western literature by a lot of students when it's reflected in the choices, because they say that we know hardly anything of India. I mean, if someone is using Indian myths, Indian symbols, Indian artifacts as a part of the system of references in his work, it is that much more difficult to students than if they were using a Manet or a Monet or a Plato or Aristotle or for that matter the Greek poets. It's psychologically, I don't know, because of our kind of upbringing, the education system, we are more attuned towards the West, and we would take that as natural. And Eliot has this wide range of references to different traditions in Europe. We would take that to be something that is fine. I mean, we can accept that. But anyone who does, I mean, what I wrote in the lines that you just quoted is that something that the metaphysicals taught us, take your image, I mean, you can raid for images anywhere, sort of. I mean, what I'm basically saying is that it's about knowing about the heart. The heart pumps blood, so a heart without blood is memory of blood. So that's what I'm trying to say, it's memory of blood. So a heart without blood is obviously a heart that has stopped. You have to realize that, it's a heart that has already stopped. So it's some kind of an impossible reaching back in terms of memory. That's what I'm trying to say. The impossibility of it all, that's what I'm trying to say. It's not just that it is an act, a physical act that you can explain. Babuda, my cousin brother, who's a doctor. He's a doctor. He would best respond to that. A heart that has no blood in it is a heart that has already stopped. It's no longer pumping blood. But it's memory of blood. How can memory survive death? So it's kind of an impossibility. That is what in the Blue Skywalk poem, the Manchester Skywalk poem that you are referring to actually. That is exactly the point that I am trying to make. That going back is an impossible act. It is not possible.
It reminds me of the idea of retrieval of memory, and there's so much work being done on the memory project in literature today. And I think our young friend here, Nitish, has pretty much opened up a Pandora's box for you. Okay.
I have my cover designer sitting right at the back. So, any questions, Debmallo? Because you were one of the first persons to see the entire manuscript, in this final shape.
Why don't you call him up to say a few words?
Yes, Debmallo, would you want to come up here? Debmallo happens to be a student, therefore they're a little,
shy.
Yeah, I guess.
Thank you, sir, and thank you everybody for giving me a chance to speak over here. Sorry to say that, but I haven't read any of the poems, but still, if we see the cover, what our teachers, our friends, mostly our teachers are saying till now is about the magnitude of the poems. If you see my so Poppies, if you look the title, you see a kind of plurality here. Okay, so all the Poppies in the Post and other poems. So mostly the poems are multidimensional. First of all, they are very colorful, they are very promising, as well as they are very, very sensitive. So to design this cover, I have to sense this at the very beginning. And madam, actually we work with the title because in most cases we don't get the texts beforehand, so we have to work with the title, seeing the title, how the cover will be, what will be the color, what will be the suitable image, as well as every book is about expansion. It is also, in most cases we see that the books are very argumentative. So in doing these covers, we have to stick to the images, the concepts, as well as we have to go with the title. So seeing the title, the Post, the Poppies, the plurality, I thought about the idea, I got that idea that this book must be about a multi-dimensional thought. So it will fuse many of the images, many of the portraits, many of the landscapes, many of them, something from history, something from mythology and all. So these are the things that I have grabbed from the title, and I have designed this book. I feel really honored, sir, that I have designed your book, and so this much. Thank you very much.
Anyone else?
My question is to the author that what comes first while writing this poetry to you? What comes first? What's in writing in your mind? What was going in your mind while writing this works?
You mean generally or any specific poem? Well, these are like anything else in life, I guess. You have an impulse, I think. I mean, this is the answer to an impulse. Every poem, I mean, every artist would tell you that there has to be an impulse. Well, that particular impulse might be a long time coming, in the sense that there may be certain ideas drifting in your mind, certain context, certain images, something that has overpowered you. So it takes time. It takes time, a lot of time, I guess. So you never know, but then suddenly it's something that arrives. I always believe that
entire poems perhaps do not come completely made. There may be a promising second line or a first couple of lines, or maybe just images. You just jot down images. And then later, another 7-10 days later perhaps, you might actually find a way of seeing the entire picture, fitting it all in. That's how it happens. So there has to be a deep down impulse in you, driving you towards that poem. As I said, the fully made poem does not arrive, all at once. It doesn't arrive. It takes its time. How it's going to arrive, again, it has its own formula. Something might come to you in a brilliant dash, right? Something that courses through your mind like a thrill coursing through your veins, almost. Sometimes the process is more long drawn, slow, long drawn. So you just have to bide your time. As a poet, as an artist, Cholojida would relate to that. You just bide your time. When it comes calling, you have to respond. I mean, you cannot postpone that and say, well, fine, I have an idea. I'm going to work on it in 7 days. I'm filing it away. You don't. So when the demand comes, when that moment arrives, you have to respond as an artist. But by and large, the rest of the times, you are biding your time waiting for that next wave, for that next moment. That's how it comes. And what your poetry is going to be about, I think that's the other question that every poet gets asked. How do you select the themes of your poems? I think that is also decided by the course of events in your life. Intellectual events, cultural events, more personal, more emotional content, images with events with has more emotional meaning for you. So they kind of already plot what you're going to write, more or less, in the near future almost. So there is no conscious, I think, marking out of certain themes which I'm going to write about. It all seems like that later on. When you analyze poetry, when you analyze art, it seems an artist was indulging in a long process whereby he had selected certain themes and he was working on them. It doesn't work like that. It's only post-event, post-production of the art that these images or these patterns emerge for critics sometimes. And if it feels like the artist is very organized. He was planning and reading up on certain things and he goes to work on that. I mean, everybody does that. I mean, the great artists have all done that. But it's the suddenness. It's something that happens. If art doesn't happen to you, if art is all chalked out, planned out, programmed out, you have made an itinerary for the next 1 year, what you're going to produce, that's not art. That's not art. So the surprise, even the artist's surprise when something so powerful hits him, the first surprise, that being taken aback, that is also a part of the artist's response, which I think the great artists also record in their work. You can see they were staggered by the magnitude of the emotion of the moment. And then they went on to craft it, give it more craft. But that first staggering is also there in their work. They can include that in their work. So I think any great writer or artist would do that. So I think that answers your question about...
May I ask you a question?
Sure, please.
Kind of related to your question is, since the great poet is working with tangible material which he sees in the form of painting, and he spent, say, days looking at it, and what I like to see in what you've done is that how you have transcended the material, so that the material doesn't in the end weigh heavily on the work, so that you have used it in such a, you have assimilated it, but you haven't let it overpower you, so your voice remains dominant. Is that how you but that, tell us, how do you achieve that having researched this, to keep that out and let yourself come to the front?
Yeah, I mean, that's I think all our artistic lives, I mean, all artists would be able to relate to that. When in our growing up years, in our formative years as an artist, even in college and university, you are in awe of these great figures. the poetry that you read, the great poets that you read, the great artists whose works you encounter, you're in awe, you're simply in awe. You just stand back. But then, if it's limited only to that, a faraway admiration, well then you have never even got close to the life that is in their art. So if one has to get close, it is by forgetting. It's difficult, I know, sometimes it's consciously difficult to do, but somehow, sometimes, in your absorption in that work of art, what one does is one gets so close to it, and it is no longer a great work by a great artist. It is something in your life. It is a moment that you have also crafted, you have also shared, you have also contributed to. So then that is when it becomes easy. Now you are already, I think someone mentioned the fact that I was seeing through their eyes. I think Pradipta made the point at the very beginning, or even Krishnadi made the point that I was trying, that's a tall order, very big thing, but it kind of comes close to answering this question by Harishda, that that is exactly where one has to reach. So a Shakespeare, or I'm just using writers off the cuff. They should not just be great things or writers whom we admire. It's like I sometimes use this analogy in class sometimes, that there are two ways of understanding poetry. It's like any one of us growing up, we have been given a diet of poetry to digest, to respond to as students, and we respond to that. We write critical appreciations and things like that, in our educational system. It is like looking at a strange insect which is inside a glass jar, but with your nose on the jar. You are not in the insect's world. You are comfortably outside. And even while you have your nose stuck against the glass, you know you're safe. The insect cannot bite you. But try getting inside the jar for once. How is life inside the jar? If you had to live like, let's say, another insect or another being inside that jar, in constant peril of being attacked by that insect inside, now then you know exactly the world that is there. So in class I say that is the difference between, let us say, anyone reading poetry, who just likes poetry, loves poetry, and let us say a poet who reads poetry by another great peer, another great writer from the past. That's the difference. Because if he or she has not been able to get inside that jar, be that person, be that insect also, live in that world, live in that pill, then how have I entered the poem? I'm always outside, beating around the bush. I'm using certain trite phrases to pigeonhole a poem into this category or that category. But I haven't got the essence of the poem, the essence of the work of art. Only when I'm imperiling myself, I'm putting myself through the rigors and the paces of perhaps what the other, my writer, my artist, my senior, elder artist has gone through. If only I can put myself through all that, through the flames, the throes of creation of that artist perhaps I can come close to understanding what exactly that work of art stands for, and maybe also find something of me over there which I can then reprise and reuse. Shoykot mentioned in passing the fact that in painting there is this regular technique of studying the great masters. In literature we do not have that. We actually say the opposite, I guess. We actually say the opposite. The fact that we say that you should be original from the very beginning. Don't copy the masters. But painting, you actually start copying the masters. Learn the basics of the technique. See their greatness. Work with it, and then maybe find something out of that forge, perhaps. So probably, I think, even in writing, even when creative writing coaches, teachers, when they tell students, when they tell prospective writers, be original, I think there has always been this, you might say, apprenticeship that one serves at the feet of the great writers. And this is, again, as I said, a very private process. You either emerge victorious out of that, you have a voice, you go on to be a writer of some note yourself, or you get lost in that maze. Obviously, we know what Eliot said about Shakespeare, and he said that he's like this cul-de-sac, of course, that we cannot, Keats said the same thing about Milton. that he's like a cul-de-sac. You just run up against a wall. There's nowhere to go. If you follow these great writers, they will just lead you into a wall. But then there are writers. And there are also certain things we can learn from even great writers like Shakespeare and Milton in our own small ways, which helps our writing. So I think it's a composite process, whereby one responds and one has to go through that phase. I think one cannot escape that phase and become a writer of note in this world.
So just to add to that, Nitish, one sec, to all of you, I'd like to say, this gentleman, in Bengali we have a phrase, Gule Kheche. So Gule Kheche, Greek mythology, and whether it's Aristotle or Plato or the mythology of the Greeks, which has been translated, not that he necessarily needs to know the language, which is an archaic language. In Robert Graves, there are many great writers who have translated the Greeks. The point I'm trying to make is, adding to what Debasish has said, if you know the rules, then you can break them. If you know that corpus of what is Eurocentric, the European civilization and what it means, only then can you chew it and spit it out and make it in your own image. So it's quite true. I mean, even in the West, when we study literature, you are required, doesn't matter if you've done your masters here, you are required to know the West and the Western poets and the great philosophers. Only then can you be original and have your own take. Right?
I'll continue with the question that he initiated, and that was, he did ask about the how you work with the idea. When it comes to writing, I mean, when I'm going to having a piece of paper and going to write down something, it becomes very difficult. So how do you negotiate these two different things together?
Could you just repeat the second part of your question, Nitesh?
How do you negotiate with your ideas when it comes to writing? When you, as you said, the actual art, it happens to us.
I'm not sure it's actually a negotiation. I think if you're negotiating with ideas, well then you would not be writing too much, because you would be endlessly negotiating. Ideas, when they come to you, they just grab you by the collar. If someone grabs you by the collar, Nitesh, I don't think you start negotiating with that person.
So then you are talking about the spontaneity of our nature of spontaneity. So it cannot, like as you said, if somebody grabs me with my collar, so the way I am acting will not be the way some martial artist will act.
No, absolutely not. But that is exactly the point.
So there is no spontaneity happening here.
If someone comes and grabs you by the collar, there are two ways to go. You can either be or try to be that martial artist, bravado and all, or what you can do is you can suddenly realize, hey, the guy grabbing my collar is actually my friend I'm seeing first time for 15 years, and that's why he's grabbing my collar. He says that, hey, you are missing me, you're going past me and you don't even recognize me. So that may be the thing. So you never know. So your response is going to be two different things. Someone who's trying to mug you and someone who's trying to catch you by the collar and remind you, you forgot me. I was your pal in school, you forgot me. So there are two different things. So, we do not know exactly who's grabbing the collar and why. So just respond. And as I said, negotiation is, I think, not the word that enters over there. Because that grabbing by the collar is beyond negotiation. You have reached a point beyond negotiation already. Now it's how you react. You have to react to it, Nitesh. You can't think too much. The thinking has already been done before. Because that moment has arrived because of all your thinking. Okay?
Our emotions and ideas, do they appear very clear in our mind? I mean, I do not think so. Like what I was asking is... Yes. The thoughts that we are having and the thing that we are actually writing, the suggestiveness that we bring down in the piece of work.
You mean, is everything...
Thoughts can be lengthy. I mean, it can be... I do not know how to put it in words.
Are you writing poetry these days, Nitesh? It's a question I'm asking you. Don't worry. I mean, I'm not trying to put you on the spot.
I try to in my own language, in Hindi.
Yes, but I think you know that poetry is not something where you... Art in general is not something where you figured it all out. If you had figured it all out, well then there's not much of art in it, actually. It's partly there somewhere, yes, of course. But then as you go along, as you go through the process, things emerge, things take shape. I mean, to say that how do I manage that duende, or how do I manage that surprising epigram at the end or something like that, it is not always managed, Nitesh. Don't try to manage poetry. Don't try to manage writing. You know, you have to know when and how to allow it to control you. I mean, the writers of the past used to talk about enthusiasm. Remember, getting inspired by some god or some deity or some muse. It's sometimes, yes, it's true in the sense that you have to allow the idea to carry you for a while. I mean, of course there will be control, but it can come later as well.
We have another question, but before that, I just want to add a little caveat there. And the caveat is, it is never, poetry is never, and this is Eliot, the great Eliot. Poetry is never about being, it is about becoming. So it's a constant state of flux.
Hello, sir. I'm Shongita Addi, a student of Pradipta ma'am from Vidyasagar College for Women. Sir, my question is that how did French painter have how did French painters have inspired you as a poet?
Thank you. The thing is, it's like being put I mean, I fear that I would be put this question at some point during the evening, the French Connection, you know. And I'm of course not referring to the film, The French Connection, but yes, why France? I mean, again, there's a bit of driftage. I ended up being in France, and you just grow up looking at these paintings, you know, in books, glossy covered books and things like that. I sincerely remember the fact that I was in tears the first time I was in Paris, and I was standing in the Orsay in front of some of those paintings which I had grown up looking at a lifetime. And ever since I was 12, 13, I was looking at those paintings. And never in my wildest dreams had I thought that I would be actually standing in front of that painting. And I don't know, I was a little overcome, you might say. So yes, those paintings have been there. I mean, it's not like that I have only a niche for French Impressionist painters. Any kind of painting, and there maybe in my future collections you might find one or two other poems which are about Indian painters, work by Indian painters. I can tell you safely that I have been working for some while on a collection of poems which will be entirely on the Ragamala, the Raga Chitras, the miniature traditions of India. So there will be maybe 100 paintings and 100 poems to go with it. I know it's an ambitious project, and I'm not even halfway through with it, but it is on. It is on. Yes, miniature paintings and the Ragamala paintings. So that is there. So it is not just that I have a special something only for the French Impressionists. All kinds of visual artists who are painters, who are photographers, who are graphic artists, they grab me. Something about the visual thing in them. And it allows for a mixing of my vision with their vision. It's a kind of it's like gradually going into water. If you have taken a holy dip somewhere or the other, whatever your religious denomination may be, imagine going down the steps of the ghat and the water slowly coming up to you. So that's a different element. You are in a different element. When the two elements, when you're inside the water, slowly and deliberately take a little dip in the water. I use this as a kind of a metaphor of trying to mingle two visions. The vision of the painter or the artist, visual artist, and your own vision. Because what you bring afresh is your set of emotions, which that artist had not thought about. You know, I mean, you might ask, how is the work of a particular artist who has a certain idea in mind, how can you just write a poem about that? Aren't you being guided by that artist dragooned by that artist into thinking like him or her? No, that's not the point. The point being that I respond to not the entire painting, but something in the painting. Immediately you would be reminded, students, of Fall of Icarus. He was minded of something which was not a great part of Bruegel's painting. You remember that 2 feet sticking out of the water of the young man going to his watery death. That is hardly the highlight of the painting. The highlight of the painting is everything else. You have to actually look for the poor man to find him in the bottom right corner, somewhere over there, the 2 legs sticking out of the water. But that is what grabbed Auden. So his poem begins from there. So he's not concerned about the rest of the painting. You know, he just says in one line, he gives it a kind of a short shrift by saying that, and the ship sailed on. The plowman was busy with his labor and the ship sailed on. That's it. That's the entire painting done. But he is more concerned about that pair of legs sticking out, about whom nobody speaks a word. That's where his poem begins. So I latch on to something in that painting. And if you read the book, you will find that in the painting also, I did not latch on to the entirety of the painting. I latched on to the quality of light, the dribbling of light down the edges of that masonry work, right down onto the street. That's exactly what I was trying to talk about. So I am relating to that only. You cannot relate to an entire painting. It's like going to be like writing an essay on the painting, which I am not trying to do. Sure.
Listening to what you have been saying for so long this evening, and there's been a lot of discussion on poetry, painting, photography, all kinds of sister arts, the bonding between sister arts, painting and photography, painting and poetry and photography. After reading your poems, I have this feeling that most of your poems are painterly poems, because you introduced me as a film critic today, this evening. Now, when I watch particularly the films of Thomas Hardy, the film adaptations of Thomas Hardy, you will see that those films are actually painterly cinema, what we know as painterly cinema. Why? Because Thomas Hardy was a novelist, but after reading his novels, you feel that he was more a painter than a novelist. So the film adaptations of Thomas Hardy happen to be all a kind of painterly cinema. So when I read your poems for the first time, and even now after so many years I have read your poems, I feel that you write some kind of painterly poems. Okay, and you don't paint. I know, as far as I know, I have never seen you painting, but in writing poetry, you actually paint canvases. That is my observation.
Excellent point. A point I want to make to you, to your point, Pradipta, is Thomas Hardy's tragic novels, say a novel like Tess of the D'Urbervilles. Yes, but Tess was made by Roman Polanski, who always says that at heart, I'm first an imagistic painter, and then I'm a filmmaker. I think in frames.
Of course, you have to understand, you brought up the question of Thomas Hardy. His Dorset scenes. It's impossible to ignore that for a filmmaker. That Dorset scene, those Dorset scenes, they will figure prominently, and that's where the light...
They figure prominently, that's why they...
Yeah, we have this... our English literature students would all know about William Hazlitt. He was strangely, again, one of my great essayists in English, and I have read him with great relish down the years. one of my great favorites actually. So he was described as, the work that he did, the kind of essays for the Round Table and Shakespeare's plays, characters of Shakespeare's plays that he wrote, they were characterized as the work of a metaphysician who was actually moonlighting as a painter. So, it's interesting that you mention metaphysics and painting. So there is a bit of both in Hazlitt's art. And yes, I try to, when I look at it.
Actually paint canvases.
Yeah, yes, and you know that there have been some suggestions about some of my poems being turned into films. 1 or 2 suggestions of individual poems being actually filmed. This is the day and age of the poetry film. A lot of these very short 4, 5, 7-minute films are being made, and they're being screened around the world, different fringe festivals and other literary festivals as well. So probably, I don't know, but I can tell you that since Mr. Eliot in the ghost, not in the body, has been so much a part of this evening, let me remind all of you that Mr. Eliot was not best pleased with the coming of cinema at all. At all. I mean, he was someone who was very peeved to start off with, and then perhaps a bit threatened by the coming of cinema. And yet, having said all that, if you read a poem like Preludes, for example, winter evening comes to root with smell of steak in the passage. Smoky days, yes. If you just read stanzas 2 and 3, where the woman, she's lying on bed, and she actually sees a film that is going on, and the description is like the light coming on in a theater after
A soul flickered against the ceiling.
Absolutely, the flicker. And there is this wonderful David Trotter book on Eliot and cinema, which is called The Flicker Effect, of course. So you see, us artists, us poets might look suspiciously at cinema sometimes, because it's a challenge to our visual representation also, how we represent the world. I mean, if I would be writing in the style of Wordsworth today, I would not be read at all, because cinema has happened. In the middle, cinema has happened. Cinema has taught us to see in so many different ways. There is television, there is cinema, there is the internet. So my vision also has been tempered by all these technological advances.
Not to forget YouTube.
Yeah, of course. So again, I mean, all of that. So I have to be writing in a world, in a milieu, visual milieu, which inheres all of that, includes all of that. There are certain ways of seeing which are pristine, which will always remain. And I have to, maybe as an artist, find those perhaps. But also bow towards all the other ways of seeing that have been inaugurated by technology. So I think I should do that as well.
Excellent. Thank you. Shall we call it a day? It's been great. You've been a great audience, so patient, so engaging, so engaged. Thank you so very much for making it out on this wintry evening. And all congratulations and all the best. Debasish, with Pradipta's support and all of us behind you, I'm sure you'll probably do what Harish has suggested. Hold up the flag and start a new movement.